up guys, Omerta here, and in this video I'm going to cover everything you should know as an arms warrior in Throne of Thunder. I'm going to go through each boss, tell you which glyphs I use, which abilities I use and when, and why I do the things I do to increase my DPS. For the sake of time, I'm going to assume you know which gems, enchants, and reforges to go for, and I'm going to jump right into the bosses. But first, here are the talents I use for every fight in this tier. Jin'rokh is a 100% single target fight with 2 to 4 burn phases. That means you should be using all of your cooldowns during these burn phases. For this fight I use the Mortal Strike, Colossus Smash, and Recklessness glyphs. As soon as the tank starts to pull the boss towards the pool, Heroic Leap over so you never have to stop DPSing. The reason I chose the Recklessness glyph is because it gives me a virtually 100% crit chance with Overpower, which usually is my top single target damage ability. When Lightning Storm is about to happen, get to the very edge of the pool and only move out as soon as the cast is about to go off, so you keep the buff for as long as possible. Lightning Storm is the only time you need defensive cooldowns, so Die by the Sword and Shield Wall are great for here. You should also be rotating your Rallying Cry and Demoralizing Banner with other raid cooldowns. If you get too low, you can always use Impending Victory. I would suggest using your potion when you have at least one trinket procced in the second pool. This fight is really a test of how well you know your rotation and how effective you are at using your cooldowns with trinkets up or potions. If you can do good damage in between the pools, that's great, but most of your damage is going to come in the pools. Arms is by no means the top single target damage spec, but with good rotation you can put out good numbers. Horridon can be a really fun fight as an arms warrior. For glyphs, it really depends on what your raid team has you doing. For instance, in my raid team I'm largely on ads and I'm the orb clicker for the Dinomancers, so I heavily focus on AoE glyphs. I like to use the Sweeping Strikes glyph, especially on ad packs like this, 2 to 3 to 4. Thunderclap is also a very important ability as an arms warrior on this fight. If you can spread your deep wounds to as many targets as possible, it's all effective DPS and it all adds towards your DPS. This here is a perfect situation for Sweeping Strikes. I'm hitting this ad that needs to get burned down, I'm also hitting the boss, I'm also hitting other ads that are around it with Thunderclap, Dragon Roar, and Whirlwind. If the boss is within range of an ad, it's always a good time to use Sweeping Strikes. He has a very big hitbox, and even if you don't think you're that close, you can still probably hit him. It takes some getting used to, but try it. Because I'm on Dinomancer duty and I have to interrupt just like that, I took the Root Interruption glyph for this fight, which is just another bonus for interrupting, adds to my DPS. Whenever there are multiple ads up, it's always a great time to use Thunderclap. As soon as the orb wore off, that's what I did, and now they've all got big dots ticking on them, and I go back to Sweeping Strikes. Interrupting should be your priority on this fight whenever it's available. Very often the Venomancers are in range of the boss too, or at least one of the Blood Guards.
It should also be noted that you can disarm the melee adds on this door. The third door is fairly straightforward. Burn adds while using sweeping strikes. Try to interrupt this ad as much as possible. It casts a fireball spell and hits pretty hard, so if you can prevent it, it'll really help on healer mana. Make sure you avoid standing in front of these warbears as they do a cleave, and it hurts. Luckily I parried that one. After you kill the warbears, a shaman hops off. Make sure you interrupt his chain lightning spell. If possible, use sweeping strikes on War God Jalak so you're hitting Horridon as well. After he's dead, burn down that dino. Council of Elders is a 4-target fight where you're going to want to cleave as much as possible. To start things off, I DPS Sewell the Sandcrawler while cleaving Frost King Malak since he's empowered first. I like to save my Dragon Roar until Khazra-Jin is in range so I can get that rolling on him with Bloodbath. I also like to keep Thunderclap out in 3 targets as much as possible. I would recommend using sweeping strikes whenever you can, whenever 2 bosses are in range. If you have the opportunity to kill Sewell before he gets empowered, I highly recommend it. If he does manage to get empowered, it's not the end of the world, just thunderclap the adds and AoE them down. When Khazra-Jin is empowered, he reflects 50% of damage taken back, so it's a great time to use Die by the Sword to cut that down to 30. However, when he's charging around the room like this, he doesn't reflect that damage, so get as many hits in as you can. Heroic Leap is your friend on this fight, and I highly recommend glyphing into it for a shorter cooldown. For this fight, I'd recommend using Glyph of Colossus Smash because there are 4 targets and you're constantly going to be refreshing the debuff. Glyph of Heroic Leap just to move around quicker and get more uptime on the bosses. And Glyph of Sweeping Strikes for those moments when you do get to hit 2 targets. Your role as an arms warrior in this fight is to cleave as hard as possible in the beginning and get Sewell down. If you can do that before he empowers, you'll be in great shape for the rest of the fight. Hopefully your raid team won't be cruel and unusual and make you kick turtles on this fight, because it is awesome to DPS. You have a ton of tools available on this fight, and I'm going to list them all. For glyphs, I like Recklessness, Thunderclap, and Victory Rush. I wouldn't recommend these for everybody, but it works for me. The reason I choose Thunderclap is because it's not an ability that I spam on this fight. I usually set it once per ads, and especially on turtles like this. 3 of them are about to come out, and wham, 1 and done. It's incredibly important that you don't get hit by falling rocks, so just sidestep out of the circles and you'll be absolutely fine. Now here's the part of the fight that's going to make or break your DPS. As soon as the off tank has aggro on the bads, throw out a Thunderclap and AoE them down. This is definitely a scenario for Whirlwind, as there are more than enough ads to justify its use. You'll notice I make it easy for myself and keep Tortos as my target the entire fight. And this right here is exactly why I choose the Victory Rush glyph. I get killing blows on the bats and use it to heal myself in the Quake Stomp. Every once in a while, you're going to get a perfect scenario like this. Trinket procced, Whirl Turtles coming out, bats land, get grabbed, Dragon Roar, Bloodbath, Thunderclap, amazing dots on every ad in the room, and your DPS is just going to skyrocket. This fight is really all about recognizing those moments and capitalizing on them. It's not always going to be a perfect scenario, but whatever you can do to help your DPS, when that happens, it's going to make a huge difference. Towards the end of the fight, there's going to be way too many ads to worry about, so keep things simple and go back to your single target execute rotation. My biggest advice for Megaera is don't be that guy that uses sweeping strikes to pad his numbers. Contrary to what it looks like, this is a single target fight and you should treat it as such. Any damage you do while cleaving is negated by the fact that the heads reset for each rampage. There are only a couple of mechanics to watch out for this fight, the first being cinders. If you get targeted by cinders, move away from other raid members, get dispelled, and then move out of the circle. I would recommend blowing DPS cooldowns during the rampages to get the heads as low as possible before a rampage ends, making it easier to transition to the next head. This is a healer intensive fight, so for that reason I glyph Die by the Sword. Every time you overpower, you extend the duration of Die by the Sword by 1 second, so you can keep it going all the way through a rampage. The other mechanic to watch out for is called Acid Rain. It delivers 500,000 nature damage to any player standing in its radius, but the further away you are, the less damage you'll take. You don't have to be too far away to take a minimal amount of damage, just be outside the glowing circle. As the heads are about to die, I would recommend getting as many executes as you can towards the very end, so your overpowers don't cost any rage on the new head. Your raid is going to be rotating raid cooldowns throughout each rampage, and you should fit into that rotation with Rallying Cry and Demoralizing Banner, and if it gets too hectic, you can also pop a shield wall macro. I would also try to fit in an impending victory. For your other glyphs, I'd recommend Colossus Smash because you're going to be fighting 7 consecutive targets.
Glyph of Recklessness would be a good third choice. However, if your raid is having healing problems, you can always use the Mortal Strike Glyph too. This is another fairly solid fight for arms, even without cheesing sweeping strikes, so don't do it. Ji-Kun is a unique fight in that there are two very different roles that you can perform, but I would recommend that you handle the nests. This is a great cleave fight, so definitely use Glyph of Sweeping Strikes. I also like the Victory Rush Glyph because you're going to be killing so many targets and you're likely going to get the killing blow. The extra mechanic to this fight is flying in between the nests, which isn't so bad as melee. It's not really worth it to go up top, get a few hits in, and then fly back down, so just play it safe and fly between the bottom nests. As soon as the eggs hatch, throw out a thunderclap and then start a sweeping strikes cleave. Chances are you're going to take a lot of damage during the quills phase, so that's when I like to pop my victory rushes. If I'm flying with another DPS, I like to call out which adds I'm attacking. I either say left or right, and then cleave that side. Make sure you grab 4 feathers at the third nest and fly up to the middle until your debuff wears off. Get in a few hits here on the boss, and then as soon as the next nest activates, head up to it. You'll know which nest is active by this red marker here. The upper nests are great because there's only 2 targets and you can cleave them like a boss. If you're a bit behind on DPS and a juvenile does hatch, make sure you get a deep wounds on it and it'll probably kill it. After you finish the third upper nest, drop down back onto the main platform, and then you're going to go back down to the bottom nest. It's pretty easy to get behind like this, but if you do, pop some cooldowns, pop your die by the sword to stay alive, victory rush, anything you can do, because this is likely going to be the last few nests. Once the boss gets anywhere near 10% or less, head back up to the main platform and finish nuking him down. Durumu should be treated as a mostly single target fight with a few quirky mechanics, and not very much opportunity to cleave. For that reason I run the standard glyphs of Colossus Smash, Heroic Leap, and Recklessness. The reason I chose the Heroic Leap glyph is because of that, Force of Will, and Lingering Gaze,
which requires you to move to the edge of the circle to avoid stacking a pool in the middle of the raid. Force of Will is a purple cone on the ground that you need to move out of or else you'll get knocked off the platform. However, if you find yourself really in a bind, you can actually heroic leap as you're being knocked off to save yourself. One of the main mechanics of this fight is called light spectrum, where 3 players will get targeted with a beam: red, blue, and yellow. It is important that you never ever ever under any circumstance move the blue onto the blue fog. Doing so will almost immediately cause a raid wipe because of a huge AoE damage it does. Therefore, whoever gets the blue beam will just stay in one spot in DPS. It's important that you have other players standing in your beam because the raid damage is split between whoever's in the beam. Tanks handle the yellow beam, so you should never be concerned with that. The red beam has the most important job. There are 3 crimson fogs that need to be exposed with the beam and killed. It is possible to sweeping strikes if they're close enough to Durumu, but not always. Just before the light spectrum goes out, there will be little circles on the ground that'll show where these fogs are about to be placed. There's going to be 3 red and 1 blue. If you can mark them ahead of time like I did with the red marker there, it'll really speed things up as the red beam doesn't have to guess where they're going and can see it. Durumu will also cast Life Drain on a random raid member. This stuns the player, does damage, and heals the boss, most importantly. The debuff goes up in stacks and should be interrupted every 2 to 3 stacks. You interrupt this by moving in front of the beam. The last mechanic to watch out for is called Disintegration Beam. If you've been in LFR, you're all too familiar with this. This part of the fight is fairly easy for melee. It kind of feels like a break once you've practiced it enough. All you need to really watch out for is not standing in the purple swirls called eyesore. These do a lot of ticking damage if you get caught in them. Just be patient and walk through the maze slowly, and whatever you do, don't get hit by that beam. Your raid will make fun of you, I promise. This situation here shows the importance of getting the lingering gaze out to the edge of the circle. This fight is very mechanics driven, so don't get DPS vision. Make sure you move that debuff out. As far as cooldown usage goes, pop it whenever it's up, especially when you have a trinket proc. If you feel comfortable enough, you can even use it in the maze. Primordius can be a frustrating fight at times for an arms warrior, but if the Blizzard gods bless you with good RNG, you're gonna do good DPS. You're going to start off this fight by killing living fluids. Once the ad is dead, you walk over the corpse and grab a random buff. However, they don't always drop a buff. Sometimes they'll drop a purple cloud, which will indicate that's a debuff, so don't walk through it. You're going to continue doing this until you get 5 levels of buffs. These buffs range from stats by 5%, mastery by 10%, haste by 10%, and crit strike by 10%. Obviously, some of these buffs are better than others for arms warriors, which is why I mention RNG. Once you get 5 levels of buffs, you'll become fully mutated and can do full damage to Primordius. Before this, it's really not worthwhile to attack Primordius. For that reason, you're going to want to save all your cooldowns for fully mutated. The reason I say this fight is frustrating because you can't really do anything about the buffs you get. It's completely random. They last for 2 minutes and you're only going to be able to get them twice during the fight. For this particular attempt, I got 5% stats, 30% mastery, and 10% crit, which really isn't a huge upgrade to my DPS. The buffs make a huge impact on how much DPS you're going to do in this fight. For example, if you get some stats and a lot of crit in the execute phase, you can imagine how your DPS is going to jump up. However, if you get haste and mastery, it really doesn't do much for you.
That being said, you just gotta roll with the punches and do whatever you can to help your DPS. As your buffs are winding down, you might want to turn onto some living fluids around you and start killing them. If the bodies still remain after your buffs have run off, you can just run right through them and get fully buffed again. For glyphs, I go back to my standards. They're fairly reliable on this fight. If you can minimize the time that you're not fully mutated on this boss, that's really going to help your DPS. Try AoEing any of the low health living fluids around. For AoE, I would not recommend using Thunderclap on this fight, as the adds will probably only get a couple ticks of deep wounds before they hit the boss. If you really want to kill them, throw out a couple whirlwinds. Other than that, just nuke away at the boss and hope you get good buffs. Dark Animus is the most mechanically unique fight you're going to find in Throne of Thunder. It doesn't have to do much with DPS at all. You should consider this another single target DPS fight, as you're only going to be fighting one target at a time ever, and cleaving does almost nothing. In the beginning of this fight, you're going to focus largely on anima golems. My raid team has me tanking 2 of them consecutively next to this inactive large anima golem, and how this works is the anima in the small anima golems goes into the inactive and does nothing. They're simply out of the fight. For that sequence, I have to use Die by the Sword to help stay alive. It gives my healers a break, and for that reason I glyph it. The other 2 glyphs I like to use are Colossus Smash and Recklessness. From this point, I continued attacking small anima golems, tanked by the normal tanks. Eventually a massive anima golem will activate, and we're gonna have to keep feeding that with small anima golems. The main ability to watch out for the massive anima golems is called Explosive Slam. It winds up, is easy to move out of, but if you get hit with it, it gives you a debuff. And if you take a second Explosive Slam, you're going to be in serious trouble. Further down in the process, the actual boss will spawn, called Dark Animus. This is going to be your target for the rest of the fight. Other damage on any of the other adds does nothing. As a non-tank melee, your role is going to be to soak the anima ring. Each orb in the anima ring gives a debuff, which is 50% damage taken from melee attacks. Obviously terrible for a tank to eat, which is why you come in. You're not going to be taking physical damage for the rest of the fight, so it does nothing to you. The easiest way to handle this is to run directly through the boss. Doing this will open up a front path for the tank so they can do exactly the same, and the boss will turn around, the tank won't have the debuff, and you will. Communication is key for this point. You can say front's open or left's open. Any way you can let the tank know you're safe. As in most fights in World of Warcraft, don't stand in the fire. There are a few ground effect damage spells in this fight, one being Animaphon. If one person gets hit, multiple people are going to get hit, which causes a chain reaction obviously. The last mechanic to look out for this fight is Interrupting Jolt, a massive raid AoE that you should be using your cooldowns for, whether they be Die by the Sword, Shield Wall, or your raid cooldowns when your raid needs them. Iron Khan is a 4-phase single target fight. Luckily as a melee you miss some of the more hectic mechanics on this fight. The first phase for melee is all about stacking. If you run 2 melee DPS it's going to be cake, if you run more it's going to get a little bit more hectic, but that's okay. Basically your raid is going to be split into 3 groups, 2 ranged groups with heals, and the tanks and melee in the middle. These groups are going to take turns stacking in order to prevent the boss from getting to maximum molten energy. If he ever gets to maximum energy, it's going to be a raid wipe. When 3 or more players are stacked, he's going to cast a spell called Unleashed Flame, splitting damage between the 3 targets and giving them a debuff for 5% more fire damage taken. You're not going to want this debuff to go much over 2 or 3 stacks, so you're going to rotate stacking the melee and 2 ranged groups.
If your raid team runs with 2 melee, the 2 of you can stay stacked the entire time, like the 2 warriors in our raid group do. When it's time for the melee to stack, the off tank runs over to the 2 of us, and then it activates us for the debuff. You're also going to want to watch out for the spear he throws, just don't stand in the fire. Basic WoW stuff. Do your best to stay spread out in the second phase, as there are a few debuffs that go out. The most challenging mechanic of the second phase is the windstorm. Luckily you're a warrior and you have heroic leap. I'll slow things down here so you can see my timing when to use it. After the windstorm, you're going to wait on this side of the room for the boss, and watch any tornadoes that come with him. Fairly easy to dodge. Heroic Leap is really useful for dodging the lines on the ground in this fight, so for that reason I would recommend glyphing it along with Colossus Smash and Recklessness. The main mechanic that you need to watch out for in the third phase is called Dead Zone. It puts up 2 deflector shields on any of the 4 sides of Ironcon, so we'll just move into the middle of him and DPS away. Try to stay behind so you don't parry as much. He still throws a spear in the third phase, so watch out for that and Heroic Leap if you have to. Jumping doesn't work unfortunately, so don't get caught up with that. Use your DPS cooldowns as they become available, just make sure you have enough for the 4th phase, which is a burn phase. For the 4th phase, your entire raid is going to want to stack up on each other for ease of raid healing. Like the other fights, it's up to you and your raid to figure out when you should rally and banner, but you're definitely going to need it at this point. The dangerous mechanic at this point is called Fist Smash, which is a large raid AoE damage. As the phase goes on, it's going to do more and more damage because the duration increases. For that reason, I would try to save Recklessness for Execute, but if it's not up, it's not up. Basically, just do whatever you can to survive and this will be an easy fight. Twin Consorts is a 3-phase fight with a little bit of cleave opportunity in the 3rd phase. The mechanics are relatively easy, but there's a big DPS check, so really pump out those numbers. In our raid for this fight, I'm the only person who can put out the armor debuff, so I roll with Glyph of Colossus Smash. I would also recommend Glyph of Heroic Leap for the 2nd and 3rd phases for this fight. The 3rd glyph is kind of optional, but I like Recklessness. As a warrior, this fight is all about staying on the boss as much as possible and dodging any mechanics that come at your way. However, you're not going to be able to dodge everything, so use Impending Victory wisely and help out your heals. If nothing else, you need to be dodging the green mist that's floating around called Slumber Spores. It'll put you to sleep, and if you sit in it, it's going to really reduce your damage, or you need to be dispelled. In the 1st phase, Lulin is going to periodically cast this Cosmic Barrage, and you need to be spread out for it just so you're not stacking too much and don't get hit by multiple barrages. Suin won't be attackable for phase 1 unless she's doing Tears of the Sun. She'll pop in, start spinning around rapidly, and if she's next to Lulin, you can cleave her. If you can't, it's no big deal, you'll have plenty of time in phase 2 to attack her, so really just pump out as much single target damage as you can on each individual boss until phase 3. Phase 2 is similar to phase 1 in that there's only going to be one boss out with a lot of movement, which is where Glyph of Heroic Leap comes into play. Suin will periodically charge at random players and leave a line of fire on the ground. Make sure you don't step in that. The tank is going to be constantly moving the boss, so feel free to Heroic Leap over the fire. You won't take any damage. In phase 3, both of the bosses become active, so this is when you use Sweeping Strikes. It's impossible to keep them together all the time, but when you can, it does help. This fight really is a DPS check, so any cleaving you can do to speed things up is great for your raid team. Once one of the bosses is down, go back to executing and make sure you avoid any of that raid AoE that you can. It really helps out your heals. Last but not least, we have Lei Shen, a very mechanics-driven fight, and I'm going to let you know everything that you personally need to look out for. Right off the bat, we have Crashing Thunder. It's just a pool on the ground that he's going to cast. You just need to move out of it as soon as possible. He's going to target you almost every single time with it as melee, so just be ready for it. He'll also be casting Thunderstruck, which is a pool on the ground that you need to move as far away from as possible. This is the footage from our first kill of Lei Shen, so things may be subject to change in the future, but here's the setup I rolled with on this kill. My glyphs were really out of the normal for any other boss on this fight. I used Heroic Leap just because of these transitions in between platforms, and I also picked up the glyph of Enraged Speed, which increases your speed by 20% while it's up. In my third glyph slot, I picked Recklessness just because it seemed to be the best DPS increase. I also swapped out Impending Victory for Enraged Regen, which is also very situational. It was only because of our raid group and the healing troubles we were having in the transition phases, but I probably wouldn't do this again. All that aside, let's get back to the fight. During this first phase, you're going to spend a lot of time chasing around the boss, and in phase 2 as well. Because the boss is able to move around so much faster than you, that's why I chose the movement speed glyphs, just to keep up that uptime. You'll notice here that I moved away from the boss, which really sucks because my cooldowns were up, but nonetheless, it avoided me getting stunned. Randomly, he'll target a player and they'll get Overcharge, which stuns them and makes them explode for a huge ring that'll stun anybody caught in it. It's possible to outrange this, but in that situation I most definitely would have gotten stunned, which would have been a bigger DPS loss. Your group is going to be moving the boss 3 times in phase 1 until he gets to 65% health, then the first transition begins. Perhaps the most important mechanic on this fight is called Bouncing Bolts. It's absolutely crucial that you get into that circle, absorb the damage, because if you don't, a new ad will spawn and it's going to really mess your raid up. When it gets to 65%, the first transition begins, and you're going to want to head to the corner that you're assigned to. As you can see here, I get the Overcharge, and I'm letting the other purple side know to watch out, just in case I hit them with it. Next up is the Bouncing Bolts. It's fairly easy, luckily, so we just move in and stack. After that, we get a Static Shock, which is something that you have to stack for, as it splits the damage between whoever is in the radius. Rallying Cry is the perfect move to use there, but whatever you do, don't use Die by the Sword or Shield Wall, because that damage that you reduce is going to be split between the other people into the Static Shock. If the Bouncing Bolts are ever too far away, this is why I save Heroic Leap. If I can walk there, that's great, but if not, Heroic Leap should always be up just in case. You never ever want to get those off. And one last thing, make sure you spread out whenever you're not stacking for Static Shock or Overcharged. In phase 2, Lei Shen will cast a couple new abilities. The first is Summon Ball Lightning. He'll summon ads on every single member of the raid team, which is why you're going to want to stack up as soon as possible and AoE this down. As you can see, I pop my cooldowns just to get them down as fast as possible. Make sure you save Dragon Roar or Thunderclap for them. The second ability is that Lightning Whip. It's fairly easy to move out of as melee, just make sure you get behind him whenever he's casting it. Also, don't stand in that lightning effect on the ground, as it gives you a little bit of ticking damage. My best DPS advice I can give for this phase is to get a Thunderclap as early as possible on the Ball Lightnings. You should be popping your cooldowns as they come up, and make sure you do effective DPS on the boss. There is still a DPS check. Phase 2, all in all, is very similar to Phase 1, just with a couple more mechanics, and this is going to last till 30%. After you hit that threshold, you're going to have another transition phase, which is fairly similar to the first one. For our kill, we chose to eliminate Static Shock from the transition. You won't see it in our corner, but sometimes he'll cast a Diffusion Chain, which spawns a Diffuse Lightning ad. If you do get this ad on your side, you can taunt it and die by the sword just to parry and take no damage and kill it down quick, but if not, you can also kite it with Hamstring. Phase 3 is the hectic portion of this fight, and I like to pop my cooldowns as soon as Bloodlust goes out. The only new mechanic for Phase 3 is Wind that pushes you around the platform, but it's fairly easy to deal with as a melee because you have Heroic Leap and because you keep moving and damaging as well. Chances are Thunderstruck is going to be a lot closer to you in this phase than it has in the first two, so that's why you should Heroic Leap around. You're still going to be getting Ball Lightnings, and those should still be AoE'd down, especially with a Thunderclap at first. And as you can see, those extra Victory Rushes are really nice for raid healing on this fight. I typically like to save it for after a Thunderstruck, depending on how close I am. As the fight winds down, your defensive cooldowns are really going to come into play here. You're going to want to use your Demoralizing Banner when your raid calls for it, and Shield Wall is your friend when you're getting really low. All in all, you have a lot of tools to stay alive on this third phase, and it's going to be hectic on your healers, so why not use them to make things easier? Well guys, that's it. If you made it through the whole video, you deserve some sort of award. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this. And if you liked it, throw it a like or a comment. I read all of them. And if you really liked it, why don't you just subscribe to Fail Squad's channel? If you have any other questions, feel free to find me on Lightning Hoof on Omerta, or you can add my battle tag.